Judging from the title, you're probably thinking I'm delusional, misguided, or just straight up insane. And maybe I am delusional. But just like all other videos on this channel, I hope you won't take this video too seriously, because I'm only doing this for fun. I know it sounds like I'm going to disappoint a lot of people by promising things that I simply cannot deliver, but we're going to do a couple of thought experiments together so that we may be able to start viewing reality from a different angle. Because I have nothing better to do, and I hope you're willing to go along with me. This time I'm going to share with you how the existence of God becomes much more plausible when you define it the quote-unquote right way, just for fun. When you approach difficult topics in a playful manner, ideas may come to you more easily, and you'll be able to see things in ways you'd never be able to while in a state of anger, repulsion, or tension. I'm no mathematician or physicist, nor am I a scholar in any doctrine. I'm just a dude on the internet with some ideas that are not even all that original. The philosophies I'm going to share with you were most likely done to death by thousands of others in the past. I'm just here to popularize them and hopefully inspire some viewers to develop them further and take them to newer, more interesting territories. So, since we all disagree on absolutely everything, from the proper way to sit on a chair to opening a door, we all define God in very different ways, regardless of whether God exists or not. But the most popular definition of God is found in the Christian faith, that God has a couple of modest attributes such as omnipotence, God is infinitely powerful, and omniscience, God knows everything. Other schools of thought propose that God is the world itself, like an inanimate force of nature, or the fabric of existence that holds everything together. A lot of agnostic individuals, such as myself, propose that God is inherently unknowable and will never be known, but I'll talk more about that in another video. For now, I'm going to mainly focus on the topic of the absolute and how the existence of God becomes much more plausible when we define it in a certain way. The most ironic thing about spirituality, philosophy, or anything else for that matter, is that our definition and understanding of truth will always change throughout the years, instead of being immutable and eternal like the absolute that we're constantly, pitifully, erringly trying to grasp. But anyway, I've rambled for long enough. I'm telling you that you can confirm the existence of God, not through any kind of mathematical proofs, direct experience by getting into a state of deep meditation, or with the aid of DMT or LSD, but with deductive reasoning, although more on a reductionist side of things. What is God? A better way to view God, in my opinion, is to define God as everything. That's it. It's as simple as it gets. But the definition starts to get a little more complicated when you start asking yourself what exactly is everything. I know that when we hear God is everything, we just feel a little disappointed. This definition is so underwhelming because everything we've known about our own existence is extremely limited. When we use the word everything, a couple of ideas pop into our heads. Time, space, colors, sound, touch, taste, beauty, ugliness, happiness, pain. Those are the only few things that we can experience. That's why when we hear the concept of everything, we immediately start to associate that word with only these things, and in these things alone. What's reality? Space and time. That's probably all there is. Because we have never been able to experience anything outside of these fundamental aspects of reality like the five senses and space-time, we can only guess what other things might be out there that we simply cannot perceive. We have no choice but to admit that we don't have a clue, and there's no point in speculating. But let's be honest, I bet that 9 out of 10 people, myself included, will be more inclined toward the idea that there is probably nothing else out there beside these things that we can experience. That there's really nothing else to life besides the 5 human senses, bliss and suffering and so on. We might say that there are probably a couple of things out there that we can't perceive, but they're probably very few in number, and not all that interesting. We can't imagine how profound something really is because our imagination is limited. We can only imagine things that we can perceive. Imagine if you were born blind. You learn that humans actually have 5 senses instead of only 4, and that objects actually have colors and shapes that can be perceived by another organ, other than through touch and hearing. One day, one of your friends sits down to tell you what it's like to have this 5th organ called the eyes. You can perceive the presence of an object without even having to touch them. As a matter of fact, you can perceive all objects around you, and you can see very far ahead. Sometimes even these objects that are miles and miles away from you. Apparently, there are some really beautiful things out there in the world. Some mountains are very beautiful. Some flowers look really nice even though they smell bad, and they don't feel all that soft when you touch them either. Lights and shadows are apparently very different, although you've known only darkness your whole life. Technically, you wouldn't even call it darkness or black, because you don't even know what that is. You need to have seen light before so you can compare it against darkness. Some puppies and kittens look adorable, but to you that word doesn't mean much. And let's not mention all the paintings, comics, and movies. What are CGI and visual effects in Hollywood blockbusters? You have no idea what they are, but apparently some of them are absolutely breathtaking. Your friend tells you about their favorite movies, and some of them are just unbelievably gorgeous to look at, but they all sound the same to you. What are even colors? No matter how hard you try, there's just no way you can imagine what any color might look like, let alone red, blue, or green. Your friend says apparently you have a very pretty face. Guess you'll just have to take their words for it. Sadly, you don't even know what that word means. What makes something beautiful? Maybe it's like a really good song or the touch of sheep wool. What makes something ugly? Maybe it's like the sound of a fork grinding on a plate or the smell of car exhaust. Whatever the case, when you hear the mention of the word beautiful or ugly, you can only relate by experiences of other senses that you do have. From your perspective, the eye organ is pretty cool, but it's probably nothing all that special. They're nothing special because you've never experienced them, and you can't even imagine what it's like to experience them. The human mind can only imagine something that it can already perceive. From this example, I hope you can see that it's very easy to assume that anything we cannot experience or perceive in life is not profound, simply because we can't even simulate that experience with our own imagination. If we can't imagine what it's like to have another organ that will let us perceive the world in a different way, how can we be confident enough to assume that this is all there is to existence? That everything is finite, and we've seen most of it. So what is everything? We don't know what it is, but for me, would it be wrong to assume that it is a finite object, and that it is limited in some way? Why should everything be limited in any capacity when the concept itself means by definition that it should encompass all things that could possibly exist? You can't say that absolutely everything is one single finite object, because it implies there are things outside of this object, which means it is not actually everything. God cannot be outside of existence because if God and the world are separated, it means that there are things outside of God, which is a contradiction, because God by definition should be absolutely infinite. So if God is absolutely infinite, and it is the world, then the world must not be limited in any way. We can understand the world being absolutely infinite as a concept, but we cannot experience or prove this, because if we can do such a thing, we wouldn't exist. Because we are finite beings, and everything we've ever known or experienced is finite. We have only 5 senses. We can only see a limited spectrum of color and sound frequencies. We can only think one thought and feel one emotion at a given time. The idea that God must be absolutely infinite is such an alien concept because it contradicts everything we know about life. But let's do a few thought experiments to see what it means for existence to be absolutely infinite. The human eyes can only see a limited range of colors produced by light frequencies of wavelengths between 400 and 800 nanometers. When we look at any color, we're actually looking at light with a particular wavelength. The colors don't really exist. They are just how the brain is designed to differentiate between lights of different wavelengths. All of the colors we can see are different combinations of the color red, green, and blue. Let's assume that there are only so many colors in this world, and that the infrared, ultraviolet, radio waves, and so on do not have any colors that are all that different from our visible color spectrum. My question is there a possibility that there is another world out there in which the light spectrum contains visible colors that are fundamentally different from our own? A completely different color spectrum, with 2 million shades of color that the human eyes simply wouldn't be able to see. For example, in our world, the light wavelength of about 700 nanometers would produce the color red in our vision. But in that world, this wavelength would produce a completely different color that doesn't belong to our physical world. Is it possible that there can be a third world with another color spectrum that have colors that are completely different from the previous 2 worlds? Is there a world out there in which the light spectrum is infinite, meaning the wavelength can become infinitely large or narrow, but still produces a specific color, and not a single color repeats in the spectrum? If there are such worlds out there, Would it be safe to assume that there are potentially infinite colors in existence? When you approach any finite concept and ask questions like this, it opens up to the possibility that the concept itself can become infinite, even when you can't directly experience or prove its existence in any way. Just because something doesn't exist in our observable universe doesn't mean it cannot exist in another place with different natural laws that make its existence possible. And just because our experience and perception of something is finite doesn't mean the object we're perceiving cannot be infinite. Let's try and examine something extremely fundamental that we all assume should be absolutely finite. Imagine that you have this spectrum. On one end of the spectrum there is existence. On the other end, there is non-existence. These terms are self-evident and require few explanations. There are things that exist, and there are things that don't exist. Every single thing that we know about ourselves and our reality is based on these two attributes. For example, horses exist, while unicorns do not exist. The concept of unicorns exists in our mind's imagination, but the unicorns themselves as living, breathing beings do not exist. What if there is another vector that can be added to this existence, non-existence spectrum? Let's call this vector X. Must it be absolutely impossible for a third attribute that is other than existence or non-existence to exist? I don't know what it is, nor can I prove it in any way, but there's no reason why we should presume that it is absolutely impossible for this X vector to not exist. Oh, you might say, out of sight, out of mind. Since we cannot experience something, it might as well not exist. But what's stopping this third vector from existing somewhere out there beyond our own physical universe? Now, because we've added a third dimension, can there potentially be a fourth vector that can be placed on the spectrum? Let's call this vector E. Since we're at it, why not add a fifth, a sixth, a seventh, an eighth, a ninth, a 10th, a 20th, a 50th, a 100th, a 1,000th, a 100,000th, a millionth, a billionth? I'm here to propose that there might potentially be an infinite number of vectors that are wholly independent from the existence and non-existence vectors. Should it be absolutely impossible for these infinite, unknown, and unknowable attributes to exist, even though we will never be able to confirm them in any way, nor do we know what they actually are? We might be able to one day create crazy, groundbreaking technologies that will help us learn more about reality, but there's a chance that we'll never be able to find out what is beyond the existent and non-existent. But must it be absolutely impossible for these infinite number of unknown attributes to not exist? At this point, I'm hoping that you might say, yes, it might exist, but it might be outside of this universe, or it might not be in any universes. But in terms of sheer potentiality, it's out there. Only that it's infinitely far away and physically impossible to locate because it's in a place that's completely separated from our infinite physical universe. If you didn't say that, you forgot to lock your front door and I'm in your living room. By the way, it shouldn't matter whether the physical universe is finite or infinite. If it turns out that our universe is finite in size and we can somehow get to its edge, the edge would just curve so that we'd be going in the opposite direction back where we came. Much like how we can circle our planet even though we're moving in a straight line. But even in a finite universe, there must always be something outside of it, even if it's just empty space. In the event that the universe is infinite, there will always be an infinite number of layers of existence that is outside of it, which makes very little sense, but there's no reason why it shouldn't exist. It might be possible to prove this using computer simulations. When we simulate a world in a video game, where is that world located? The map is procedurally generated, and in order to save on RAM, the game deletes old terrain every time the character travels far enough into the world, subsequently making the world infinite in size. In a way, this world has no boundaries, but the whole thing is still confined within a tiny 60 GB SSD cartridge. If you're a character in the video game, it's literally impossible for you to confirm there is another world that contains this virtual world. But there's no reason for the character to come to a conclusion that the world they inhabit in is all that there is, or that what is outside of their world is finite. So how does the idea that everything is absolutely infinite proves the existence of God? Because that's the core definition of what God should be. You know what? The term God is loaded and confusing, so let us just call it using other names such as nature. Nature is absolutely infinite and can only be defined by what is always outside of itself. Let me say it again. God or nature, absolute infinity, or the everythingness, can only be defined by this process of discovering what is outside of itself, forever. When you conclude that God cannot be finite in any way, and that God is absolutely everything, then God must exist. God is not the world. The physical world, like the video game analogy, even if they can stretch infinitely, is still a finite object, because there will always be an infinite number of layers of existence that is outside of itself and overlapping on top of itself. You've probably heard the phrase, if it can exist, it must exist. The idea sounds incredibly far-fetched, if even delusional. But why should reality be finite in any way possible? Wouldn't that also be an equally bold assumption? The main concept here is that I want you to start treating all attributes in reality like the periodic table. Even the most fundamental attributes like heat, cold, light, shadow, thoughts, emotions, space, time, existence, non-existence, cannot be finite in number. What I'm asking you to do is to basically take anything that is foundational in reality, that can be put on two ends of a spectrum like the relative and the absolute, the real and the unreal, the infinite and the finite, or anything that can be put in a spectrum with multiple parameters such as the color spectrum, the sound spectrum, the number of sensory organs that we use to perceive reality, and ask yourself the question, can there be something that is outside of this spectrum? Or can there exist another vector on the spectrum? If the answer is a maybe, we follow up with the question, can the number of added vectors be infinite? When you ask yourself these questions, you won't get any answers, but at least the thought exercise will make you rethink what a definition of God, nature, reality, or existence might be. Like the periodic table that keeps acquiring new elements throughout the years, so too will everything else in existence continue to be discovered. And the number of elements might potentially grow bigger and bigger forever. You can argue that the periodic table can have a finite number of elements, and we may never be able to find new particles in the future, in which case you're absolutely right. Currently, we've discovered 118 elements, and there's a chance that we'll never find the 119th in the future, even billions and billions of years from now. Although just because we can't experience or prove the existence of something using equations and advanced technologies, doesn't mean that it cannot exist. If you're born blind and you've never seen a picture, a tree, or the sky before, it really makes no difference whether you acknowledge the existence of the color spectrum, nor will you be able to tell what the color red, blue, or green looks like. The only reason you know that colors exist is because everyone around you say that they exist. But as long as you cannot see colors, then rainbow might as well don't exist. You might ask, but why should everything be absolutely infinite? Everyone can make that argument without having to prove anything. I can say Goo Goo Gaga exists, but it doesn't mean anything, nor should it exist necessarily. Let's talk about something that we often take for granted to be infinite: numbers. We all agree that a number can be infinitely large without having to spend an eternity drawing 0s on walls to prove it. Mathematicians keep creating these numbers that keep getting bigger and bigger, and give them ridiculous names like Google and Googleplex. We'll never be able to find the largest number possible, yet we all agree that a number can be infinitely large. The number infinity is an assumption that we agree exists. A number can keep getting bigger and bigger because the conditions are right, which makes it seem possible that it can be infinite. So too must everything else in existence be infinite, as long as the conditions in a universe are set in the right way that allows it to be. Just like how we can assume that a number cannot be finite in size, we shouldn't make the assumption that any attribute in reality is finite in amount, even though there is no way we can prove the existence of those unknown attributes. At the end of the day, does God exist? You can apply that question to a finite God, but not the God. I've already talked about the existence and non-existence, and the infinite vectors that are beyond them. The example was meant to show you that the attribute of existence is not something that is above God, but only an infinitely small, finite part of God. The journalist Thomas Emilio Villa had also made a similar argument, though his quote can only be found in a small section in the ontological argument article on Wikipedia. He says that, if God is God, must be a greater idea than the one of existence or non-existence. It is beyond it, otherwise the bigger idea is not God, but the idea of existence itself. If God is God, then must be beyond the ideas of existence and non-existence. It must be a meta-existing being. Therefore, the question whether God exists or do not exist is a nonsense. By the way, before you start doubting the idea that absolutely everything must exist because it seems some things are just impossible, I want to remind you of the fact that we have black holes and supernovas in our physical universe. Compared to those giants, science fiction superhuman abilities like time travel, clairvoyance, and teleportation don't seem all that impressive. The Milky Way galaxy contains roughly about 200 billion stars, our sun being one of them. And the sun alone can outlive all of us and cast its light on the solar system for billions and billions of years. At the same time, the Milky Way galaxy is a literal grain of sand compared to our observable universe. If nature can come up with things like that, why should anything be impossible for nature at all? Just because there are an infinite number of things that are impossible for us humans doesn't mean that it should be impossible for nature. Because nature is the one who came up with the concept of possible and impossible, just like everything else in existence. When you entertain the possibility that there are things beyond existence and non-existence, and that existence and non-existence are part of God, not the other way around, the idea that God, or nature, is absolutely infinite and must exist becomes an obvious conclusion, even though we have no idea what it means, nor do we know how to prove it in any way. Basically, it's pandeism. But the world is much, much more than just time and space. That's the only way scientists can keep making new discoveries. By asking ridiculous what-if questions instead of simply packing it all in and leaving the lab early to go home and play Fortnite. If you assume that something might be possible, at least you'll try. Once you've decided something is impossible, then it's all over. So what can we do now once we've discovered that nature is absolutely infinite to make our lives better? Nothing. All of this is done for fun. If you want to find meaning in your life, there are better alternatives such as spending more time in learning a new skill or working on a passion project you've been putting off for a long time. At least with this knowledge that the world is absolutely infinite, whenever you run into an obstacle in life, you can be sure that there will always be a solution out there somewhere waiting for you. Does that mean when I say Goo Goo Gaga exists, then it should exist? Yes, it does exist, but it doesn't mean anything. I know you're being sarcastic and you're making a point that the idea is stupid and delusional. I am delusional. A person is delusional when his beliefs do not align with objective reality. But what is reality? Any attempt to explain the nature of reality will ultimately be wrong, because reality keeps creating these paradoxes that contradict itself. So everything I say can be proven wrong very easily, simply because there is no way for me to prove the existence of things that I cannot experience, explain, or even imagine. As long as I cannot touch the horn of a unicorn, then the unicorn will continue to not exist. So now I've created 3 possible options for you to choose from. 1. Everything is infinite. 2. Only some things are infinite while everything else is finite. Or 3. Everything is finite, nothing is infinite. What I've been advocating is the possibility of the first option being the absolute reality, and you might fall into the second or the third category. Whatever the case, all 3 schools of thought must ultimately be wrong. All truths can easily turn into lies the moment they are put under the right conditions. For example, let's imagine that one day technologies might develop at a point where we create an independent simulated universe in which there is an infinite number of attributes that are completely procedurally generated and can be perceived by the player. Even though for the real world we live in, we can only perceive a finite number of attributes. Which world would be considered an objective reality, the simulated or the real world? You might say that some things are finite because that's what we learn from direct personal experience. I'm here to tell you that from my own experience, I've never found a single finite object that can exist without being inside a larger structure. Since all that we've experienced and have ever known exist in the form of finite objects, it's safe to assume that all things, whether finite or infinite, must have a larger structure outside of itself. This never-ending process of expanding and going meta is what God or nature is all about. That's what it means to be absolutely infinite. And this definition must ultimately be wrong, because it doesn't prove anything, nor can it disprove anything either. Free will doesn't exist, and all ideas are bound to be wrong when they're set under the right conditions. The things I share with you today don't mean anything, and in a couple of weeks I might change my stance on all of them and tell you the complete opposite. Who knows? Concepts are made up, just like how all attributes in our day-to-day existence are made up. They don't mean anything. Our fear of suffering and fear of death may make us think otherwise, but deep down, you know that's also part of the script written by natural conditioning. So just relax and play the roles that were given to us.